So, welcome back to this course on managing change in organizations. Uh, till date we have completed two modules, 2-week courses. Now, we are moving to the third week, and in this week we will talk about the diagnosis part, that how do we identify what kind of change is required. You remember in the beginning we started with discussing that there is a need to identify whether change is required or not, and that is why we talked about why we need to go for a change. And then the next part basically we discussed about that what kind of changes are required, and that is where we discussed about incremental changes or transformational changes. And then we also talked about the different kind of changes that takes place in organizations. For example, whether the change is going to be in strategy of the organization, or the structure is going to be changed, or the culture, or the technology, or the people related issues. Now, when we are discussing, we also try to see that how we can go for a better alignment between these factors or these areas of changes. But before we decide whether we go for a particular change, we need to decide where the change is required, right. So, now what we are going to discuss is that how we go about identifying what kind of change is required, and for that we will be discussing certain frameworks, models and tools which helps us to identify where the change is required, right. So, basically in this week we are going to cover these following concepts: how to go about diagnosing, what are the models and approaches to change, and then we will also discuss another important issue related to this is that how we are going to identify the kind of resistance that could be faced by the organization from the employees and other stakeholders when you go for a change, and finally, how we are going to manage resistance. So, these are the various concepts which we are likely to cover during this week, especially in the third week. So, we are starting with organizational diagnosis, that how we go about diagnosing. So, when we are talking about diagnosis, it means that you need to identify where the change is required. So, when you go for identifying where the change is required, you need to follow certain steps, certain frameworks, certain models, right. So, the steps that include that, to start with, you need to look at the various models which are available to you. So, there could be a number of models which are available. Okay. So, you can use any of these framework depending upon your requirement. At the same time, you can use more than one models, but it is always good to go for one model. So, you need to create a conceptual model for diagnosis, and then see whether the model that you have selected is going to help you to identify the areas where the change is required or not. And then once you select any particular model, the next task is to see that in order to use that particular model or framework, what are the various information that is required. For example, if you use any particular model, so this model asks for certain information. We will talk about these models at a later stage, but here what I am trying to tell you is that if you want to use any model for diagnosing, then you need to make sure that you have all the information which is required by that model or framework to make use of it. So, you look at whether the information that you require is available, and if the information is available, you need to collect that information from various stakeholders, maybe from the employees, from the management, or from other sources. So, once the information is gathered or collected from various stakeholders of the organization, and then you use this information, put it into the model, and then go for analyzing that. So, this analysis basically would help you to see that whether this model is fitting into the data that you have obtained, and then that would also help you to see that where the problem is. So, you will be able to locate the problem areas only when you analyze the model based on the information that is available to you. So, it is very important to select a model see whether the information is available or not, and then use that information to analyze and interpret the data to ensure or to find out, you can say, the location or the area of change, right. So, when you are going to use any diagnostic framework or models, you need certain information. Now, why we are using certain diagnostic models or frameworks? Because if you are not using certain frameworks or models, what happens? Then probably you try to explore each and everything, right, and it may be more time consuming, you need more resources, right, and you are not sure whether you will be able to find out the area or the location where you need to go for a change. So, these the frameworks or the models have been identified or have been used by practitioners, you can say, to find out the problems or those areas where the requirement for the need is, the change for the need is required. So, you have to use these models and that actually simplifies your job, right. So, these models basically are nothing else, but they have emulated real world situations and they try to see that what are the possible areas where the change would be required, right. So, they identify those areas where the change is required. So, they are basically known as components. So, they identify the components and they also identify how these various components are related to each other, because suppose you identify components as structure, system, strategy, culture, people, technology. Now, if you are able to identify these components where the possible changes are required, then you also need to see that how these areas are interconnected or related with each other, right. And as a result of this interaction, what kind of outcome is being produced by you, right. And that is why it is always good to go for some kind of diagnostic models, so that you know that okay, these are the possible areas, these are the kind of things or information that you require, these are the things that you need to interpret and decide, and then it also tells okay, what is to be done and how to act. Instead of that, if you are not using any of these diagnostic models, probably you are in a more exploratory mode. Okay. You try your best, you look for information here and there, and then you try to see where the change is required and you are not able to identify, which could be more time consuming, also resource consuming. So, it is always good to use some of these diagnostic models, and these diagnostic models basically help you to proceed in a guided direction to find out where the change is required and then acting on that. And that is why we go for using these diagnostic models. Now, moving further, see, when any of these diagnostic tools or models are used basically to bring about a change. Now, the change managers have a big responsibility there, right. Remember, we talked about change managers and their images, right. So, different kind of change managers use different kind of tools, right. So, depending upon what kind of change manager you are, right, you are going to use one of these models, right. And these different the reason I am telling you that why different images that these change managers has, because their inclination or tendency to use certain things based upon the ideological framework of that particular image, right. And you know that if you have different images, they also actually are used to see that how change is being interpreted. So, different image change managers who have different images are going to illustrate or use the same context or the same situation in different ways, right. So, the idea here is that since a number of models and frameworks are available, and depending upon the requirement, the change managers are going to use a particular tool, a specific tool, and this depends upon what kind of image they have formed, right. So, what we are going to discuss next is that depending upon the image of the change managers, what kind of diagnostic tools they are likely to use. Now, if you look at this, this talks about 6 different images that we have discussed in the first week, like director. If you look at the image of a director, it is a top down approach, right. and they always try to control things. It means that if they want to go for a certain change, they decide about it and then they go for it and ask their subordinates to implement it, right. So, if you are following this particular falling under this particular image, then what kind of diagnostic tools you are likely to use? So, you to start with, what you do basically? You first of all you try to get information, okay, based on your experience and knowledge, that what needs to be changed, and then you see that how these variables or the components in that particular model are related, and then you would be in a position to identify where the change is required, right. Now, if you look at other change images like navigator. So, navigators they find that okay, yes, these tools are good, they could be used, but to start with, what they do basically they try to map the environment. The basic idea of mapping the environment is to identify whether there is a better alignment between these components and the environment, both the internal environment and the external environment or not. So, they would be using different kind of models, right. Then coming to the third type of image, that is caretaker. Caretakers basically are not bothered about what kind of changes need to be brought in, and they do not fall under the category of what you call shaping, or they go for a more participatory approach. So, they are less concerned about the kind of diagnostic tools that is to be used, whether it is incremental changes or whatever changes that they want to do, but they try to look at what kind of situation is there. So, they try to create a scenario of the future. They use this PESTEL. PESTEL is a basically they try to look at the environment, that is political, economic, social, technical, right, and legal environment. So, they look into this kind of environment, and whatever insight they use they get out of this analysis, they try to identify the trend in the external environment, and based on this trend in the external environment, they try to see what needs to be done, right. Coming to the image of coach. Coach, as you know that they are supposed to build up the capacity of the people, so that they can better cope up the challenges of the change. Now, with this orientation, they basically would try to focus on those tools which help them to achieve the goals and objectives, and then they see that whether in order to achieve those goals and objectives, what kind of competencies people need. So, they try to identify the goals and objectives, they also try to identify the competencies that is required to achieve the goals and objectives in a changed environment, and then see that whether these diagnostic tools are going to be helpful or not, right. Coming to interpreter. Interpreter basically they also try to do similar things, but before that they try to make sense of the situation, they try to understand what kind of change would be required, they try to make an interpretation both at the cognition level, and then they frame certain situations, that okay, if this is the situation, this would be their understanding and interpretation, and based on that they would follow a particular framework or model. Models we will be taking up later, what are the various models and frameworks. And finally, we have nurturers, and nurturers have a different kind of strategy altogether, because their idea is to nurture the people, right, and they are less concerned with the task that is at hand, right. So, they are not very sure that whether these diagnostic tools are going to help them. So, the basic idea of this particular image is to go with the people and see that what needs to be done to develop them in such a way, so that they can cope up with any kind of change, right. So, they are not much bothered about the utility of these diagnostic models. So, if you are being guided by this particular image, then you may not even use any of these diagnostic tools and frameworks. So, you probably try to explore on your own without being confined to a particular framework or model, because if you look at these frameworks and models, they have certain limitations, because they talk about certain components, the interaction, the relationship between these components, and analysis and interpretation of these components to identify whether this component is working well in the organization or not, and that is how they will be able to identify whether the change is required in that particular component or not, right. But having an image of a nurturer, they do not look into these things, right. They are not going to be confined by the boundary of these models and frameworks. So, they go on their own, they try to understand the environment and see that in a particular context how this environment is going to influence the organization and then what needs to be done. So, nurturers might take more time even to identify what kind of changes are required, because if you have a guided framework, that always helps you to identify things more accurately and precisely in a less time with less resources, but this does not happen with some of the images like what you call say nurturers or the caretakers. They are less bothered about the diagnostic tools and frameworks. But anyway, when we are talking about these tools and frameworks, they are always useful, they always provide some information, some guidance that how to proceed with to identify what kind of change is required. And that is what the next point I wanted to identify, that why we go about identifying change using these diagnostic tools and frameworks, right. What is the advantage? As I told you that if you do not follow any of these diagnostic tools, what will happen? You take more time, you consume more resources, but still you are not sure that whether you have been able to identify the right component. Now, even if you are able to identify the component, it would be very difficult. Again you move to a exploratory mode to identify why did it happen, because you need to link it with the environment, right. For example, if you find that the problem is the strategy. Now, if a strategy is a problem, why this strategy is not working, right? Whether because there is a change in the environment. Then again you go back and look at the environment, scan it, and then come back to strategy and try to have some kind of alignment, and then you move forth to see that whether other factors or other components are aligned with the strategy, say structure, culture and other components, right. So, it is always to good use to good some kind of diagnostic tools, models or framework which are available, which have been practiced a lot also. It is not that they have just been made, these are not theoretical models, basically they have been tested empirically, made valid to different contexts and situations, and they have been used by practitioners to see that whether these diagnostic tools and models are working or not. Now, coming to this point of advantage, see why we are using a particular diagnostic tools. As I told you that it makes your job simple, because it breaks down various components into independent components. So, that is how you simplify a complex situations, right. And then you see that what are the areas where you need to pay high attention. So, you can even prioritize which part of the organization needs more attention and which part need less attention, and how the various components are, the properties of the organizations are interconnected, because these models basically have already specified that how these components are going to be interconnected or interrelated, right. And then it provides a uniform language some say Python or a trend you can say here, to see that how you are going to discuss the characteristics of the organization, right. And finally, it also provides a guide or a sequence of activities that need to be taken in change situation. It is not that you want to bring about a change in a structure, right, even if you are able to identify it properly. Now, whether these structural changes required some other alignment into or not, that is also identified using these models. So, you know that if you are going for structural changes, what kind of other changes you need to bring about, so that you have a better alignment, you have better connectedness and interrelationship between these variables or properties of the organization, right. So, there are a lot of advantages of using these diagnostic tools, because they put you or confine you to certain frameworks with a boundary. They have already identified what are the various components or properties where usually change happens, how these properties are components are interrelated, right. You use a common language for that, right. It also helps to identify other sequences of activities which you need to follow if you go for a change in a particular component or the property of the organization. Now, what we have discussed just now is that what are the various advantages. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see here that different frameworks, these are different frameworks 1, 2, 3, 4. These 4 frameworks have been depicted here without identifying the component or the other things. So, without identifying the components, see that how these all these frameworks basically have certain components 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here you have 5, here you have 4, here you have 3, 3, 6, 7, right. So, what thing is there that these if you look at these diagnostic tools models, each of them differ from each other, right, in terms of how many properties they are able to identify with a particular model. Now, the idea is that you have say 4 different models, right, for diagnosing the area of change. Now, the next thing that you require very seriously is that which one out of these 4 is to be used, right, and why you want to use it. So, here is the individual you can see, and he is trying to see that okay, out of these 4 available models, which one is to be used, right, and why he wants to go for this. So, ultimately you see that based on his analysis of the requirement and see whether the information is there, whether he is in a position to analyze and interpret the information that is given, he has been able to identify this framework which he is going to use to identify the change that he wants to bring in, right. So, it is very important that you are able to select a proper model, right, because if you are not able to select a proper model, what will happen? You will not be able to proceed, right. So, it is important that if you want to go for proper diagnosis, you select appropriate tools and frameworks. So, there are various tools and frameworks which are available. Now, what you need to do is that you need to identify which one best suits for your requirement, right. So, moving further, what we are going to discuss next is the 2 different kind of models are available in the literature. They are known as component model and holistic models. Now, component model basically try to identify various components, right. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that they have been able to identify a number of components like mission, strategy, leadership, which is going to be influenced by the external environment. Then you have culture, system, say needs and values, performance, tasks and individual roles. So, there are a number of components that the model is able to identify. The model is not specified at here, right, because it is not related to a specific model, but these are the various components that could be a part of a particular model, right. Now, when we are talking about component model, basically they are going to see how the organization works, right. So, they look at these systems and processes, structure, technology and these kind of things, and then they are able to identify, say why this has been identified, it means it has been picked up, showing that okay, this is a component which needs to go for a change. It means the culture of the organization is not good or weak. So, this need to be made strong, right. So, when we are looking at the component model, they look at various components and they identify which component is not effective or which component is not working, right. So, when we are using component model, basically the idea is to identify which aspect of organizational functioning is not good, and here out of this you can say 10 or 11 components they have been able to identify okay, that in a hypothetical case that this particular component, that is culture, is not working effectively, right. Now, look at another example. See here again you find that the same set of properties or variables are identified in the component model, and here it is not the culture, but in another case they have been able to identify that it is the structure of the organization which is not working well, right. So, maybe if you look at the different kind of change images that we have been able to identify, there are cases when different change managers are based on their understanding and interpretation are able to identify not just one component, but a number of component that needs to go for a change. So, it means at this level, based on the analysis using component models, what you are going to do? That you are going to bring about a change in the structure of the organization. And you remember in the last class or in the last week, we discussed about what are the different kind of structural changes that you need to bring in, right. Whether you want to reduce the number of levels in the hierarchy, or whether you want to go for say deleting some of the departments or units, right, or whether you are moving to more decentralization or going for less formalization, right. So, different kind of structural say forms are available, and it means that you need to bring about a change in the design of the organization. But if you want to bring about a change in the design of the organization, then you also look at the other components, that how this is connected or related with other components. So, you also need to bring about a change in other components of the organization as well, right. So, these are the component model where you try to identify a component, but what are the drawbacks of this component model? I am trying to give a very old example here, the story of 6 blind men feeding elephant. Now, you see this is the organization and these are the various parts of the organization, right. It is a symbolic representation of an organization which is considered here as a elephant, and these are the various parts or components of the organization. Here you can see it. Now, different people are looking at different components of the organization. Okay. So, what kind of problem would come up if you are using component models, because you are able to just assess just one part of the organization, right, and different people are going to understand and interpret different part of the organization, right, because each one is going to touch generally only one part of the organization. Like in this example, you are going to touch only a part of the body of the elephant, right. For example, if you touch this part, the leg, right, you think that it is like a pillar, right. If you just touch the tail, right, you think it is like a rope, right. If you look at the trunk part, then you think that it is like a tree branch, right. If you look at the ear, then you think like a fan, right. So, the interpretation and understanding depends changes because you are just looking only at one component or one part of the organization. So, this analogy can be given for the organization also. For example, who looks at the belly says it is like a wall, right, and who felt its tusks, oh, it is like a spear. So, if you look only at specific components, it may not give an idea about the whole organization, right. So, there is a need to move what you call from a component model to a more holistic models, right. So, the first approach that we talked about here, that like you start by using component models to examine how many different aspects of organization are working. So, now here you identify that okay, these are the two parts of the organization which are not working well, right. So, in a component model you are not going to look at other factors whether they are working well or not. So, you only focus on culture and structure and you try to bring about a change in the organization, right, while you overlook other parts of the or other components of the organization. Now, when we go about using this component model, so you also need to look at different aspects, then only probably will have better say broad understanding of how the organization is working and what are the various areas which needs to go for a change and how these are interconnected with each other, because interconnectedness is another important factor, right. So, moving further, say it is like this. Just by identifying this, it would be difficult for you to build up the big picture, unless you relate it with all the components, right. So, once you have been able to identify, the best thing is that you see that how it could be related with other aspects, so that you can have a big picture, right. So, it is always good to look at the big picture instead of a part of the organization. Otherwise, you just touch or look at only one part, analyze and interpret it and find whether there is a problem or not, right. So, these are some of the drawbacks with the component model, and that is why we move to a more holistic model, and in holistic model which is different in the sense that it does not look only just one part of the organization, but it looks at each part of the organization, right. So, in this approach basically we try to look at the big picture by examining each and every component in detail, right. So, that would help us to identify those components which requires change and then see that how these components are largely interconnected with other components of the organization. right. So, you are looking at the entire elephant and then you will be in a better position to understand that which part of the elephant is not good, which needs replacement, right. So, which part of the organization is not working or functioning well, which needs some kind of change, right. So, if you look at these holistic models, they provide you better explanation, okay, right, more holistic explanation of the entire organization instead of looking at a part of it, right. Now, moving further to discuss, say that what actually happens if you are going to use in the holistic model. So, what is more important here is not only to identify those components which are not functioning well, but how these components are interacting and related with each other, right. Starting with external environment, right, to the leadership, to the mission and strategy of the organization, to the culture. And if you look at it, you can see that how many interactions a particular component will have, right. For leadership, if you look at it, it is connected with the external environment, mission and strategy, because leaders are going to identify external environment, they are supposed to identify mission and strategy, they are supposed to build up the culture in the organization, they are going to identify what kind of management practices will be there, they are also responsible for building up a structure, systems and policies. So, see this leadership is related to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 component. So, you find that yes, leadership is not working and you need to bring a change in the leadership of the organization, it means that would also need to bring a greater alignment in these 5 factors which are interacting with this leadership, right. So, what is more important is to identify the nature of interaction between the component which go for a change, right. So, the holistic models are better than what we talked about earlier, that is component model, right. Now, the most important thing, as I have discussed earlier also, is that any kind of analysis starts with diagnosing the external environment, right. While it is important to identify the external environment, but some of the models do not talk about the external environment, they only talk about the internal environment, right. So, when we go about diagnosing the external environment, the idea is that you need to ensure what kind of environment the organization is operating, right. So, what you do basically, you do some kind of analysis, it is a very famous and well known analysis which is done in the area of strategy, which is known as SWOT analysis. So, SWOT analysis basically helps you to identify the strength, the competence of the organization, the capabilities of the organization, and also the opportunities, where the opportunities for the organization is this in terms of markets, growth, technologies, anything. Then what are the weaknesses of the organization, right. These weaknesses could be related to any of the component, right. And then who are your competitors, with whom you are going to face threat, right. So, now if you look at the earlier model also, this model, see external environment is a part of the component. So, it is very important to align your external environment and accordingly you decide about strategy and other things. And that is why you will find that some of these models talk about external environment, while some of these models does not talk about the external environment, right. So, it is important to assess the external environment and then identify what needs to be changed, right, to improve the performance of the organization, right. And similarly, not only diagnosing external environment, but you also go about identifying it in detail, right, like strength, what are strength, how are you going to exploit that strength, right, because you are going to build up the organization based on your strength. For example, the strength for Honda is its engines, right, it is one of the core competence. So, they are going to exploit this part to build up the organization, then identify the weaknesses, what are weaknesses, and then you also identify ways that how you are going to reduce those weaknesses. Then where the opportunities are available to you, what are the markets where you can grow, identify that how you are going to capture those markets. Then who are your competitors, you need to identify them, and how you are going to deal with these, so that the threats is reduced and you are able to grow and perform well, right. So, analysis of the external environment is very important. Then coming to the internal alignment, you also need to, this is basically shown to ensure that okay, how we are going to align internal environment. Some of the models not only focus on the external environment, they also look at the internal environment, that how you go for better internal alignment to see. Now, these are the inputs. See, this input is going to help you to identify a structure, task, culture and people, and then the output, right, which is required by stakeholders, external stakeholders in terms of product and services. Now, when we are talking about this, it means based on the environment, you are going to identify them and then make sure that there is a better alignment, and then you identify what are the products and services you are offering. One of the best example is McKinsey's 7S model. We will talk about that at a later stage, but since here we are talking about the internal alignment, we need to ensure that how we go about better alignment of internal structures and factors in the organization, right. Moving further, so what we have been talking about is internal external environment, and based on that we can ensure that how we go about better diagnosis of the factors or the components using both either a component model or holistic model. What I would suggest that it is always good to go for a more holistic models, because there you are not going to identify a particular factor, but you also see that how this factor is going to interact and influence other factors, right, so that your performance is good, right. So, with this we are going to close this session. Thank you very much.